The sun was sitting low and gold over the Bitterroot Valley, the kind of light that makes even tired old barns look like something worth painting. Walter Ainsley was 63 years old, and he had lived on this ranch. His whole life he had buried a wife here, 11 years back, and he had buried his own father before that, and he had come to believe that the land was the only thing in this world that didn't eventually leave you. He was standing by the corral that afternoon, running his hand along the saddle on his horse Copper, when he heard the gate creak behind him. Rosalind Guijen. Let me restart that thought. Clean. The sun was sitting low and gold over the Bitterroot Valley, the kind of light that makes even tired old barns look like something worth painting. Walter Ainsley was 63 years old, and he had lived on this ranch. His whole life he had buried a wife here 11 years back, and he had come to believe over the years that the land was the only thing in this world that didn't eventually leave a man. He was standing by the corral that afternoon, running his hand along the saddle on his horse, when he heard footsteps behind him in the grass. He turned, and there was Rosalind she had come to the valley that spring to help her aunt, who ran the general store in town, and somewhere between April and August, she had started showing up at Walter's ranch on Sunday afternoons, saying she wanted to learn how a real ranch worked. Walter suspected that wasn't the whole truth of it, but he never said. So Rosalind was 31 years old. She had dark hair that curled at the ends, no matter the weather, and she had a way of looking at a person like she was actually listening, which Walter had noticed. As rarer than it should be that afternoon, she walked up beside him and rested her hand on the horse's neck and said she had brought him something, apple pie, her aunt's recipe. Walter said that was kind of her. She said it wasn't only kindness. He didn't say anything to that. He just kept working the leather of the saddle a little too carefully. There had been a moment 2 weeks before that Walter still turned over in his mind. Some nights when the house was quiet, and the only sound was the wind fin ding its way through the eaves. They had been sitting on the porch steps that evening, watching the sky do the thing it does out here, where it turns 3 colors at once and doesn't apologize for any of them. Rosalind had said something soft. She had said she thought about him during the week more than she probably should, and Walter, being a man who had spent 11 years building walls out of good sense and grief, had laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man trying to talk himself of something before it got too far. He had said, Rosalind, you're 31 years old, and I'm 63. That's not a small gap, that's most of a lifetime. He had said, you're too young for an old ranch. Yet he had meant it as a kindness. He told himself that he meant to give her an easy way out before either of them got in too deep, but Rosalind hadn't flinched. She had looked at him steady, the way she looked at everything, and she had said to me, you're perfect, and then she had stood up and gone back to her aunt's house and left him sitting there with the sky changing colors above him, and his heart doing something he hadn't felt it do in over a decade. Now standing at the corral 2 weeks later, the pie between them, Walter found himself thinking about that evening. Again he set down the saddle and looked at her. He said, Rosalind, I've been turning over what you said. She waited. She had a patience to her that Walter admired more than he let on. He said, I built this ranch with my wife, Margaret. We worked this land together for 30 years, and when she passed, I figured my life had found its shape already. I figured the rest of my days were just going to be quiet ones. Rosalind nodded slowly. She said, quiet isn't always peace, though sometimes quiet is just a room nobody's walked into yet. Walter looked at her for a long moment. He said, where did a 31-year-old learn to talk like that? She smiled and said her grandmother. She said her grandmother had married at 45 after losing her first husband young, and she used to say that grief teaches you the shape of love, but it doesn't get to keep the rest of your life locked up if you decide otherwise. Walter was quiet after that. He looked out at the mountains, the way he often did when he needed a place to put his thoughts. That wasn't another person's face. He told her then about Margaret. He told her about the way she used to hum old hymns while she hung the laundry, and the way she had taught him patience back when he was a young ma. And with a temper that ran hot and quick, he said losing her had felt like losing the only proof that he was capable of being loved properly. Rosalind listened the whole way through without interrupting. Yes, he had a gift for that, letting a man finish his own sentence, even when it took him a while to find the end of it. When he was done, she said, Margaret, Sounds like she was a remarkable woman, he said she was. She said, I'm not asking you to replace her, Walter. I'm not foolish enough to think that's how thigh. Cess works, she said. I'm asking you to consider that there might be room in a man's heart for more than one good thing across one good lifetime. Walter ran his hand through his graying hair and looked down. At his boots, the way men do when they're working something out, that words alone can't quite settle. He said, folks in town are going to talk, she said. Folks in town always talk, Walter. That's mostly what keeps them busy that got a real laugh out of him. Not the careful, nervous one from before, but something. Inching looser, something that came from further down. He said, you really aren't afraid of any of it, are you? She said. I'm afraid plenty, I'm afraid of plenty of things, but I've found that being afraid of the right things is different than being afraid of the good ones. There was a long quiet between them. Then the horse shifted its weight, and somewhere off in the field, a meadowlark started up its evening song. Walter said something his own father had told him once a long time ago, back when Walter was unsure of everything. His father had said, son, a good rancher doesn't wait for perfect weather to plant. He reads the signs and he trusts the ground, and he gets to work even when the sky looks uncertain. Walter said he had spent 11 years waiting for weather that was never going to come. Because he was waiting for a sign that loving again wouldn't hurt. He said he didn't think that sign was coming. He said maybe the ground was just asking him to trust it anyway. Rosalind's eyes went brig. HT at that, the way eyes do when something true finally gets said out loud. After being carried quiet for too long, Walter reached out then, not quite sure of himself, the way a man is when he's doing something for the first time in over a decade, and he took her hand in his rough weathered one. He said, I'm not going to pretend the years between us don't exist. I'm not going to pretend this is simple, he said, but I think I'd like to find out what it looks like anyway, if you're willing to be patient with. An old man who forgot how to do this. Rosalind squeezed his hand and said, Walter, I have never in my life felt the need to be patient about something I already knew was right. They didn't rush anything. After that, they were both wise enough, or maybe just tired enough, of pretending to know that the things worth having are rarely the things you hurry over that fall. Rosalind kept coming on Sundays, only now she stayed through supper too, and sometimes, after Walter would walk her partway back toward town under a sky thick with stars. Neither of them had any need to name the folks in town, did talk, just like she said they would. But by winter, most of that talk had softened into something gentler. Use anyone who saw the two of them together saw plainly enough that whatever this was, it wasn't foolish. It was just two people who had found each other at an unlikely time and had decided that unlikely didn't mean wrong. Walter used to believe that the land was the only thing that didn't eventually leave a man. He had learned something different. That year he had learned that sometimes the land teaches you to wait for the right season, and then it sends someone walking up through the grass with apple pie and patient eyes to remind you that your story isn't finished just because one chapter closed. He thought of his father's words often after that. A good rancher trusts the ground. Even when the sky looks uncertain, Walter had trusted it, and the ground had given him more than he ever expected. At 63 years old, standing by a corral in the gold light of late summer. If this story stirred something gentle in you, we'd be grateful if you would like it and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us which part touched you most, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, stories about love that arrives later than expected and means just as much. We'll see you in the next one.